Hey everyone, so in this video I'm going to be talking about Storybook. Now I've talked about Storybook in the past, but it was in the context of several other tools, so I want to dive a little bit deeper in this video and just kind of show all the features that Storybook offers, or at least some of them. I can't go through all of them in this video, but I'm going to give you a pretty in-depth tutorial in this video. So when building an application, it is pretty easy to see the changes you're making on the screen because of things like development servers and change detection. For example, if you're working on a web app and you decide to make a change to the padding of a button, you'll be able to see the changes after saving your code. That's because web apps are inherently capable of running in your browser. That's the whole reason you're likely building the web app in the first place, right? But let's turn this around and say that you want to develop a component library for something like React or Vue or just even raw JavaScript in isolation that apps can import. Well, in those cases, things can get a little bit tricky. Let me kind of explain what I mean by this. We've all been there. We're working on an app and we find a React, Angular, Vue, etc. component that solves our problem. So we npm install it and import it into our app and we're good. The beauty of componentization is that you can share your component across multiple projects and with multiple people. So anybody across the world, if they have the same problem that you were able to solve, they can use your solution. However, when developing new components for frameworks and libraries such as React, Vue, etc., you need some way of seeing what you're building as you're building it. This is because components are not applications. They require an app to import it and to use it in order for it to come to life. To think about it more technically, components do not really have, well, they don't have a index.html file. So an application obviously has an index.html file that the browser understands and is able to display on the screen. It imports all the JavaScript, all that good stuff. Components don't have that. They're just a piece of an app, and they rely on the fact they're being loaded by an actual application in order to be brought to life. Now, if you're building a component, you could build an app that you use to ingest that component so that you can see it on the screen, but that takes extra work and it can get pretty complicated as you start to build more variations of this component or more components in general. So this is where Storybook comes into play, and it makes our lives a lot easier by acting as the ingesting application for your component while also providing you a bunch of really awesome tools that make your life easy when building component libraries. Storybook essentially provides you with a runtime environment to bring your component to life with change detection, and provides you with a nice user interface to display your components along with variations of them. So with all of that out of the way, I want to go through the process of building a component using Storybook and showing a lot of the features along the way. But before we hop in, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any of the future videos that I make, and let's begin. All right, so in this tutorial, I'm gonna be using React. Again, you don't have to use React. You can do this with vanilla JavaScript, you can do it with Angular, Vue, Svelte, etc. But the point is that throughout this video, I'll be using React because I think the majority of my viewers are familiar with React and that's what I prefer to use. So just keep that in mind. So in front of me, I have a command line interface and I have an empty directory. So if I ls, you can see there's absolutely nothing in this folder. Go ahead and get to the same point where you have a directory that you're going to use for the project, and then we can carry on with this awesome tutorial. So what is it we're going to build? What component are we going to build using Storybook? We're going to build something called Tablr, Tablr. Tablr. It's just a data table that allows us to pass in props and make it super customizable without having to build it ourselves. Because let's face it, if you want to have a table that has things such as like you can pass in the colors and you can pass in the paddings, etc., without having to implement it all yourself in CSS, it'd be so much better to use something that already exists than to implement it yourself. So we're going to do that, and we're going to use Storybook to show you how to do that and all the awesome features Storybook has to offer, hopefully. All right, so let's begin by doing the very first step, which is creating a React application. Now, the reason why we're going to use Create React App is because it's the easiest way to bootstrap a lot of the tools necessary to build React stuff. But we're going to end up removing the React script dependency of Create React App. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So I'm going to run npx create-react-app, and then I'm going to name this Tablr. That's the name of the component I'm building. So right off the bat, it's going to install this. However, it's going to be an actual React application, which we don't want. We don't want everything that comes with a React application because we want React apps to be able to install this. So this is going to be a component, not an app. So the very first thing that we have to do once this finishes is to go in and uninstall React scripts, which is going to get rid of a lot of that heavy load that we probably don't want to have alongside of our component. So I'm just going to let this finish. So that has finished on my end, and I went ahead and cleared my console out. The first thing I said I wanted to do was uninstall React scripts. Let me show you something. So I'm going to open up my VS Code really quick. Let's pull this open, and I'm going to open up the folder that I'm currently working in. So I opened up the Storybook folder, and now you can see there's this Tablr folder, and that contains my React project, which contains a package.json file, which I'll zoom in so you can see that the scripts contain a command called React scripts, which is basically this library right here, which we're about to remove. So I'm going to start by removing this. And in order to do that, goodness, that's big. Okay, well, hopefully you can see all this. I'm going to run npm uninstall --save react-scripts. I'm going to let this run, which should take just a second. Clear this out. I still see React scripts. That is because I need to go inside of the Tablr folder. So let's go inside of the Tablr folder, run npm, and just run the same command here. npm uninstall --save react script. Let this go through. Now you can see it's removing a ton of dependencies because React scripts has a ton of dependencies. So by removing that, we are getting rid of a ton of bulk. So now let's see if it's there. Okay, yeah, it's gone. But now that that's gone, these scripts will no longer work. So if I try to run npm start, this won't work. It says React scripts is not recognized as a command. That's because that no longer exists. So we need to change our script. So what are we gonna do in order to run the app? Well, we don't really have a way to run the app right now because it's not an app, it's a component, right? So now we have this app.css file. We have this, this normal setup of a React application, but we don't have a way to run it. And while we're here, I might as well go ahead and delete this public folder too, right? Because the public folder is for apps. It has the index.html file, the logos, the stuff that the browser cares about. But again, this is not an application. So let's delete this. Delete the public folder completely. We don't want that. All we want is this stuff right here. I'm going to get rid of the logo. I'm going to clean this up. Let's go ahead and clean this up while we're here, So I will delete that. Let's get rid of the test file because in this particular tutorial, I'm not going to be writing tests for this. And we can keep the app.js and the app.css, but I'm going to go inside of my app.js file and remove the return statement. And for now, just return a simple thing that says Tablr. Yep, so save that. And inside of my index.css file, that looks fine. Index.js file. We might get rid of this because we're not injecting anything into a root anymore. We're no longer following the convention of a React app. This is a component. So actually what I really can do is just come in here, delete all of this, and just simply export everything from app.js, which we might rename shortly. So let's go ahead and just export everything from app and pretty much close this file for now. So here we have our app.js file, which is only going to render the word Tablr. But again, we don't have a way to run this. So what we're going to need to do is install Storybook. Inside of my little terminal here, I am going to run the following. I'm going to install prop types because Storybook is going to utilize prop types in order to do some fancy stuff, which you'll see pretty soon. So npm install --save prop-types. Let that install. And let's also install a Storybook CSS modules preset, which is going to allow us to use CSS modules in our Storybook project. So npm install --save -dev storybook -css -modules -preset. And this is going to give us CSS module support. Now that we have those, we're going to do one more thing, and we're going to install npm install --save, and let's do @storybook /addon -preset. I'm sorry, post CSS. If you don't do this, you're going to get a deprecation warning from our previous preset. So we need to have this installed so that we don't get that deprecation warning. Now that we have those, let's go ahead and add this to the main.js file, which we don't have yet because we need to install Storybook. So let's actually install Storybook itself. npx storybook, or SB for short, init. So npx SB init, just run that command. And what's going to happen here is it's basically going to scan your project and figure out what type of project it is. In our case, it's going to figure out that this is a React component, and it's going to install the proper dependencies for Storybook to run within the context of a React application or React component. If you're using Angular or Vue, it's going to do the same thing. So that's super awesome. Thank you, Storybook, for that. That is a huge feature because it allows you to just have a single command to do pretty much any initialization you need for Storybook, and it gets all of those dependencies hooked up for you. See, as you can see here, it says detecting project type, check mark. It found out that we're in a React project, and I'm just going to keep letting this run, and we'll come back as soon as it's done. Now that this has completed, you can see that there's this new command that I can use, npm run storybook. But how did that happen? Well, let's look in the package.json file, and we can see it created a command for us called storybook. And the command is start storybook -p, which is the port number specifying port 6006. And it also created a build storybook command, but keep this in mind, we don't need these commands anymore, the start, build, test, and eject commands, because they use React scripts, which we no longer even have in our project. So what we should probably do is take these commands, for example, storybook, instead of running npm run storybook, wouldn't it be better just to run npm start? So I can take this command here, cut it out, and replace the start command with this. Then I can get rid of the storybook command. And now when I run npm start, it's going to run the storybook start command. And I'm going to do the same thing for build storybook. Instead of running build-storybook, I just want to be able to run build and then have it work immediately. Then for test and eject, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of those. By the way, we could have used the eject command to get rid of all of the dependencies here, but I didn't want to do that because I wanted to explain how all this stuff works. But just look into the eject command if you want to learn more about that, okay? So now we have the start and the build storybook commands, but I'm gonna get rid of the -storybook here, so it's just start and build. And now we have the capability to start up storybook. So let's see what that looks like. If I clear this out and run npm start, let's see what happens here. Okay, so as you can see here, we are welcomed by Storybook here with a nice clean looking UI. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so you guys can see it a little bit better. And let's take a look at what's going on here. We have this toolbar up here, and then we have a little bit of an introduction. Then on the left, we have a left rail with some navigation. And as you can see, these are names of components. If you think about a component library, you might think of things like a UI component library that contains things such as buttons, headers, and pages, especially if you use something like Material UI, for example. So here we have button, and then underneath here, we have variations of this component. Super interesting stuff, right? So let's take a look. Button, primary. This is what the primary button looks like. You can click it, and you can change the color. You can choose whether or not it's primary. It's true by default because we're on the primary variant. We can change the label here. So let's say, haha. We can change the size, and it looks like we can even do something with the on click, but it's not happening here. We might be able to log something. Secondary, so another variant. You can see the button changes here, large, small. So as you can see, this gives us a really, really convenient UI to be able to showcase our components and variations of your components. So if you have multiple variations of the way a component looks or behaves, you can have them all here in this convenient UI really easily. Now, keep in mind, this isn't just for showcasing components. This is also for developing along the way. So here you can see the component, but you can also go in, and as I change the padding in the actual source code, you'll see it update live. Now, if I put both of these on the screen at the same time so that we can kind of see the code and Storybook on the same screen, I want to go into a folder that Storybook created for us automatically that you didn't even notice probably. If you go into the source folder, there's this new folder called Stories. Now in Storybook, there is the concept of stories, and a story is basically mapped directly to one of these. So you have a button story, a header story, and a page story. And over here, you can see that that's the case. Here we have button.stories, header.stories, and page.stories, and they correlate with each item that is on the left rail over there. But notice if I expand each of these stories, you can see there's a primary, secondary, large, small. There's variants of each of these. So where are those coming from? Let's take a look. So let's start with the button. So first we have the button component itself. So this is the literal button component, the React code. Then we have the story for it. And the story is what allows us to render that component on the screen using Storybook. And as you can see, we're exporting a primary, a secondary, a large, and a small, which correlates directly with each of these variants. So what we're doing is for each of these variants, we are creating a template.bind instance and then providing arguments that vary based on which variant we are on. So for the primary variant, we're providing different args than the secondary variant here. And as you can see, primary is true here. If I were to put primary as true for secondary here and save and go back here to secondary, you can see now the secondary button is actually primary now. So I want to get rid of that. So save it, go back, and now you can see it automatically goes back to it being secondary by default. So you can create instances of each of your components in native React looking code, basically. As you can see, we're rendering this. So template is just a rendered React component, and we're binding to it and providing args, and we're just creating multiple variations of these. This is just a clean way to write this syntax, essentially. Okay, so there's also this thing here, right? This is the default, export default. Well, this is a module, button.stories.js is a module, and we're doing a default export here for this file. So this default export, whenever we import the story, or when Storybook imports the story is what I should say, it's gonna get this object right here. And this object contains a couple of properties. We have a title, which is example/button, which I'll show you something interesting about that in a moment. And then we have the component itself, which is just a reference to the actual component. So here we're importing button from button. Again, button is just coming from the actual component, the source code itself, and we're importing that. And then we're setting component equal to that value. Then we have arg types, and arg types is where we're going to specify the type of argument that it is. So for example, background color, it knows it's a string. It knows it's a string because of prop types, which we'll get into in a moment, but it knows it's a string, but we don't really want the user to come in here and have to type in a hex value manually in order to choose the color of the button, right? So here we're able to pass in the fact that the control is a color. So now Storybook knows, hey, background color is a string, but specifically it's a color. So now we can allow the user to just come in here and choose the color like this. So it's really convenient. It provides us a super awesome, very easy way to build what you see here. So that pretty much gives you an idea of what's going on the screen that you just saw. But I want to show you a little something about this title here. Let's look at this. As you can see, we have multiple levels in this hierarchy of stuff here, right? So we have example, and then under example is introduction, button, header, and page. And then under button is primary, secondary, large, and small. See, inside of here, you can actually organize these inside of a sort of hierarchy. So here we have example, but let's say you have a huge component library with tons of different things, and they're different categories completely. So for here, we could say these are UI components, and I can save this. And what happens is now there's this new UI hierarchy that's outside of the example hierarchy, which now contains the button component and all of its variants. So by coming inside of here and changing this first piece here, you can actually go even further and say actions or controls. Controls make sense. And then button. You can actually do this, and let's see what happens here. Now inside of the UI hierarchy, you have a folder called controls for things like toggles and checkboxes. And now you're able to organize things so neatly right out of the box. Again, super easy way to do that because all you have to do is provide a path here and it generates that for you in the left rail. But I'm going to keep this as example actually, let's change this to Tablr /button. We're going to get rid of this component in a moment anyway, but just to kind of show you that that's how that works. And you can also call this something else other than button. You can call it BTN if you want. And obviously it's going to update here as well. So super good stuff. All right, so let's take a look at the button source code really quick so that we can figure out how it knows what the values are. See, look, size. It knows that there's 3 options for size, small, medium, and large. How could it possibly know that? How? Well, the answer is pretty simple, and that is prop types. See, back in the day, we would use something called prop types, and people still use it all the time. I'm not saying this is an old technology that's in the past or anything like that, but with TypeScript, things kind of, less people started using it, let's just put it that way, because of TypeScript. But prop types is still a very valuable tool, and I'm gonna use it in this because I'm not using TypeScript in this tutorial to make it easy for you all. And let's see how prop types correlates to this in some way. Well, we know that the button component is located here. This is what was generated automatically for us by Storybook. It's part of their demo. You can see that they're importing prop types, and here is the actual rendering of the button. So this is the component itself, and underneath it, we're using prop types to specify the properties that are allowed to be passed to this particular component. So in here, we can say that there is a property called primary. So we're allowed to pass a prop called primary to this button component, and background color and size. These are all of the available props. Then down here, if we don't provide any props to this component, these are the defaults that will be passed in automatically. And as you can see here with prop types, we're able to specify what, not only the prop itself, but also the type of prop. So primary is a Boolean. It's either going to be true or false. Is it primary or is it not primary? The background color is a string. The size is going to be one of small, medium, and large. And that is exactly how Storybook knows to render this here. Now we could go in and actually specify inside of the arg types here, we could specify a different type of control for this. In fact, let's see what we can do here. So I have size, and right now automatically it knows that it's one of these three things. So it renders this super convenient, basically radio selection for us. But let's see what happens if we change it to something else. So I've gone to Storybook's documentation for controls here, and I wanted to see what was available for enums. This is an enum because we know it's going to be one of three values. I mean, I could go in and say text, but then somebody could type in a value that we don't support, such as super large or extra large or something, but we don't support that with that component. We only have small, medium, and large, I think, right? Small, medium, and large. So we want to use an enum control because it limits what the user can select. So right now, by default, it's going to use the radio selection, but we can do inline radio, we can do check, inline check, select, and multi-select. Now we don't want check because that allows the user to select multiple. Same thing with inline check, but what would be cool is maybe a select. So we could do select. Let's try that. Let's go in here and say size, and let's specify the control select. Save it. And let's see what Storybook gives us here. Now we can see for size, by default, it's medium because that's the default. Let's take a look really quick. I just want to make sure none of this is magical to you. You understand everything that's happening here. The default props here, we're setting the default props, and medium is the default. That is exactly why when you go to here, it's medium by default. Even though in this particular case, we're not specifying medium, it just knows that it's medium by default. If I were to come in here and say size large, then it would be large by default. Anyway, you get the point. So now we have a select box that allows us to select. Now, I personally think that the radio selection was a better choice, but I just wanted to demo that for you really quick so you can understand that you can totally choose your own control and really truly customize this very easily by just passing in certain options. And you can actually go much further by creating your own controls. Read up on this documentation if you want to know more about that. So let's go ahead and start building our actual component, because this is super cool to show you how all of this is working, but let's be honest, we want to know how to create our own component here. So I'm going to actually delete everything inside of this stories folder. So inside of stories, I don't want to delete the stories folder itself, but I want to delete everything inside of the stories folder. So delete. Now what happens when I go to Storybook? It says, there's nothing here. It says you need to add some stuff. But it also says the glob specified in main.js isn't correct, or no stories are defined in your story files. In our case, no stories are defined in our story files. But what is this main.js thing it's talking about? Let's take a look at that. As you can see, the stories folder isn't the only directory that Storybook generated for us. It also generated this .storybook folder, which contains some configuration that we want to take advantage of. So inside of main.js, if you remember, before we actually initialized Storybook, we installed a preset. We installed a CSS modules support. Let's go ahead and add that here. So in order for us to get this to work properly without getting that deprecation warning, we need to make sure that we add both of these lines right here. So go ahead and add these two lines to the add-ons array here. Storybook /addon -post CSS. Don't forget that @ symbol. And then under that, the actual preset itself, which is Storybook -CSS -modules -preset. Don't forget that we installed both of those at the very beginning of the tutorial. So if something doesn't work right for you when you try to run this in just a moment, just know that maybe you forgot to install it. Who knows? Who knows? All right, let's see. Oh gosh. npm start. I just want to make sure that it runs. Okay, I'm getting this warning here. That's totally understandable because this warning says that we found no files matching any of the following globs. That is to be expected because we don't have any files in our stories folder anymore. So that is totally to be expected. And that appears to be the only warning. Above this was just a mistake in my typing, ignore that. But yep, looks like we are good to go. Okay, cool. Just wanted to verify that there was no warnings in the console because we want to make sure we do everything the right way. So back to the main.js file. In certain scenarios, you might want to customize the way that Storybook compiles, or maybe even the way that it looks. And you can do a lot of that inside of here. You can throw in some add-ons and you can actually set up some stories, but there's more things that you can do inside of here that is a little bit out of the scope of this tutorial. But if you're wanting to head into that more advanced sort of learning for Storybook, highly recommend you check out Storybook's website so that you can see and read into their documentation, where they have pretty much everything you need to know about Storybook. Also, be sure to follow them on Twitter because they post updates. So without further ado, it's time to start working on our component. Now, inside of the source folder, we have this app.js file, which we're going to use in order to create our component. But we kind of already have the component, right? It doesn't do anything, it just renders Tablr. But I just want to go ahead and get that into Storybook so that Storybook actually is doing something so that we can save and see the updates on the screen as we build this component out. So what do you want to do? You want to go ahead and create a new story. And we're going to call this Tablr.stories.js. And now that I've created this, we're able to now create an instance of our Tablr component and render it on the screen. Now this we are just calling app.js. So maybe instead of calling it app.js, we could rename this and call it tablr.js. So I renamed my app.js file to tablr.js. And in doing so, I also want to change how I'm handling CSS. Now, the app.css file, I don't need because I'm not doing any CSS right now. There's no CSS being handled. But what I will end up doing is using CSS modules, which we'll set up in just a moment. But since I'm not using CSS right now, there's no reason to have a CSS file. There's also no reason to have this tests file or this report web vitals file. So I'm just getting rid of all this stuff that I really don't need. I also do not need this index.css file because, again, this isn't an application. We don't have an index.html file. None of that is needed. So now we've really made this project very lean, where we just have an index.js file that's exporting the app, which is now Tablr. And we have the tablr.js file, which is just rendering out the word Tablr. Sweet. Now I'm going to, for now, or maybe permanently, we'll see how this goes, I'm going to get rid of this. I don't want to export as default. Instead, I want to export it as a named export. And I also want to use an arrow function. Now you don't have to do all this. You can keep it the way that it was, and you can use default exports and imports. That's perfectly fine. But I want to do non-default. I want to do named. So I'm going to name it Tablr, export const Tablr, and I'm going to make it an arrow function because I prefer to use function components using arrow functions. It's totally just preference. Just don't want to confuse you in case you're kind of newer to React, but this is just a different way of writing what I just wrote and exporting it as a non-default export. If you don't know what that is, I have tutorials on all of these things. Please check out my channel if you want to learn more. But continuing on. So let's go to our Tablr's story file and let's start by obviously importing Tablr. So let's import Tablr from, now it is outside of this directory inside of the source directory itself, and the file name is Tablr. Now we're importing it. Notice the curly braces. If you're still doing a default export, you would want to make sure that you do not include the curly braces. Again, if you're kind of confused about that, check out the difference between default and named exports. But the second thing we want to do is create the default export here for Storybook, since Storybook is going to be what is using this stories file. So export default, and you just want to default export an object which contains a few properties, right? The first one being title. Now the title here is just a string, and I'm going to call this Tablr, and I'm going to add a hyphen and just give a little bit of information about what this component is all about. A customizable React table component. Then under this, I want to pass in the component prop, and the component is Tablr. So the only thing left is the arg types, but we don't have any args yet, so I'm going to leave that empty. Now I want to create a template. So const template is equal to, and we want to use an arrow function to render out our component. So args goes to, and let's render out our Tablr component. Now there's no props, so this can actually be it for now. Now all we have to do is export a variant of this. And to do that, we'll just export const and then the name of the variant, which in this case, I'll just call default, set it equal to template.bind. So I'm creating a new instance of my Tablr component. And then I just want to save because I don't have any args that I want to provide here right now because again, Tablr does not accept args yet. Let's see what happens over here on Storybook. So right off the bat here, it says that this story is not configured to handle controls. So I'm going to close this because there are no controls for this yet. Now, as you can see, nothing is appearing on the screen yet. So why might that be? Well, the reason why is because of a mistake I made, which is the fact that React components here need to start with a capital. So I'm going to actually rename this to capital letter Tablr. And then I'm going to come in here and just rename everything to a capital T, including the tag here, and then save. And let's see if we see Tablr here on the screen. Now it's bigger because I went back and added an H1 tag, but you will probably have seen something that looks more like this. So here we have Tablr. It's rendered out on the screen. Awesome. We now have a React component that is being rendered using Storybook. So now all we really have to do is start building this component out. And as we build it out, we're going to see it on the screen. It's beautiful. It's amazing. So let's start laying down the functionality. Now, obviously, this isn't a tutorial on how to build Tablr, so I'm going to do a lot of copying and pasting, but I'm going to provide you with the link to the source code so that you can copy the same stuff that I'm copying, okay? So with my code editor open, I think that I can safely bring this over, hopefully, so that we can see both on the same screen. And for now, I really don't need to see all of this stuff because I only have default. So I'm going to click this little button here. Over here, if you see where I clicked, there is a button that allows me to full screen this so that I can see the component a little bit more clearly without having to see that huge left rail for no reason. So with that said, let's start setting up the Tablr component. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the props that it's going to accept. So I'm passing in the props that we're going to be destructuring out of the props object that we're allowed to pass into React components. In this case, we're going to have the following props here: rows, headers, border width, cell padding, etc. And then I'm setting some of these equal to a value, which basically allows us to have a default value. So if we do not provide a border width, we're going to end up with a default of medium. Same with cell padding. So these are the defaults here. So go ahead and paste those props in right into this argument here that destructures all of these properties out so that we can access it within the component itself. Now, obviously, if I save this and come over here, there's going to be no changes because we're not doing anything with these props. We're still just rendering Tablr out. We need to actually start rendering something out onto the screen. So the next thing I want to do is just basically create an effect. Now, if you're not familiar with React hooks, I have a video on that. I'll leave in the description below so you can check it out. That video gives you an idea of how React hooks work in about 6 minutes, so check that out if you want to. But useEffect is what we're going to use to handle a little bit of logic around error handling for props. So I'm just going to paste this in here. I need to make sure to import useEffect. So let's make sure we import useEffect from React here at the top. And I'm going to go ahead and actually full screen this so you can see all the code on the screen. But all we're doing is if the headers.length is less than 1, and headers is one of the items that we can pass in as a prop, if we don't pass any headers in, we want to throw an error. And we're checking to make sure that the length of the rows matches the headers, because in a table, for every header, you want to have what I'm calling a row, but in reality, it's a column. That's just due to the way that Flexbox is going to be working because I'm using Flexbox for this. But just think of rows as columns. I know that's a little confusing, but for every header, you want to have a column, right? You don't want to have an empty column and just have a header hanging out there. So this is going to throw an error if those don't match. So just get that in there. Then we want to create 2 objects here: cell padding map and border width map. Now, cell padding map is just a object that maps a word such as small to an actual pixel value. Same exact thing for border width. If you want a thick border width, that's going to be 3 pixels, etc. And then finally, all we need to do is render the component out now. So instead of Tablr, I'm going to get rid of Tablr and paste in the component. Again, you can just take all of this from the source code. Now that we're doing this, you should notice something a little bit interesting, a little bit odd, whatever you want to call it. We're setting the class names here as styles dot and then the class name. This is the pattern of using CSS modules, which we installed support for in the beginning, but we don't have a CSS file. So let's go ahead and copy that from the source code. And then inside of your source folder here, just create a new file called style. Actually, let's call this Tablr, tablr.module.css. Tablr.module.css. Now I'm going to paste in the CSS here. You can see we're adding the main, column, cell, header, and header classes, although I said header twice. Save this, and now we can import that as if it was an object. So just come up here and import styles. So import styles from same directory, tablr.module.css. Now if I save, we should not get any errors, and we should see something on the screen. Okay, it says cannot read property map of undefined. Now where this is coming from is the fact that we are mapping through the rows, but we're not passing any rows in where we're rendering this component. You see, we're rendering this component inside of this stories file, and we're not passing in any args. We need to pass in some args. So the first thing I should do is destructure, or not destructure, but spread all of the args that we pass into the template. So whenever we use this template.bind, we want to make sure that we also underneath this set the props. And then here we want to make sure we render those props, which we're accepting as an argument here. So under here, we need to actually set some props to render out a table, or else we're going to get an error. So all I'm going to do is underneath this, paste in my arguments for this particular rendering of this component. And I have some rows. The first row is this is just a test. The second one is this is also a test. And each row is just an array of strings. And each string is a value for a cell in a row. Then we have the headers, which is also an array of strings. So I'm setting these here. And if I save, maybe we won't get that error anymore. And we don't. We do not get the error anymore. And we see a table being rendered right in front of us. Now I'm going to click this X button here. You see, I want to be able to see the props below, but we don't have anything here. We closed that just a moment ago, so I want to make it visible. So how can I do that? So since earlier on in the tutorial, I clicked this X button here, I couldn't figure out how to get it to come back. I was like, where is it? Maybe it's in here. There probably is an option right here to do it, but I found out by Googling really quick that thanks to Charlax, I can use inside of here, if I click inside of here and click the A button, it makes the controls tab appear. Now I can click the A button again and it's gone, and I can click the D button and it makes it appear on the side, and then I can just toggle it using D. Super convenient stuff, just so you know that that exists. Now, what is going on here? How does it know that this is a color? It knows that it's a color, I think, by just simply inferring it, because I don't think I specified anything in here that says it's a color. I didn't add that in the controls, and I haven't added prop types yet. So I think what happened was it probably read this and realized that it's a color, or it could have read the property name and saw that it is color in the name. I don't know, but Storybook is really intelligent. It tries to figure out what you're doing and make your life easier for you without you doing any work. One of the reasons why I love this project so much. So without having to do anything whatsoever, it immediately knew that this is a color. Now let's change one of the colors. Let's go in here and say cell text color. Let's make it white. As you can see, it changed right before our eyes. The header border color we can change, and the background color we can change. Super cool stuff. And if I don't like what happens here, I can just go here and click the refresh button and it resets everything. Now that's cool that we have the ability to set the colors, but there's still some things that I don't like. For example, cell padding, we know can either be thick, medium, or I'm sorry, small, medium, or large. And border width can be thick, medium, or thin, or something like that. We don't want the user to just come in and be able to type in a bunch of random stuff, because we're going to end up with an error of some sort, because that's not a valid answer here. So we need to go in and specify the props using prop types, and then add them to the config. So let's do that very quickly. So within here, I am currently inside of my tablr.js file. So this is the component file itself. At the very top, I want to import prop types. So at the very top, I'm going to import prop types. Notice that it is a default import, and we're importing it from prop-types. And at the very bottom of the file is where I want to go ahead and set up the prop types. But I am exporting this as a default export, and I can't do that anymore. I can't do that anymore because I might be able to do that. Let's see what happens. Let's experiment here on this tutorial. So I'm setting the prop types, and I don't think I'm getting an error, so this might actually be fine. Now, I pasted in the prop types, and you can see that what I did was added prop types array of prop types.string. So it knows that it's an array of strings for the row and the headers. But one thing that I did was for the border width and the cell padding, I said one of thin, medium, and thick, and small, medium, and large. So now Storybook knows to include it as an enum, however you want to pronounce that. Now, the only other thing left here is that I don't want to be able to pass in the rows and the headers here within this control section here. I like the ability to change anything as aesthetic, but when it comes to the rows and headers, I don't want to be able to customize that here. I only want to be able to customize that by passing in the props right here, by passing in these arrays right here. I just want to limit it to only being able to edit it there. So how can I do that? Well, you can go in and add the arg types property here to your default export. and make sure that the T is capitalized. Then for that particular property, for example, rows, we can set the control to an empty string. And by doing so, let's see what happens. Now you cannot edit that anymore. It basically removes your ability to edit this from within this panel. I want to do the same thing for headers. So now for both rows and headers, we set the control to an empty string, and now you cannot edit either of those from within here. You can only edit these. And for each of the properties that you can edit, you are able to limit the user to a specific type of value, for example, color or an enum here. So as I change this, you can see it gets thick, the text gets small, the padding gets small, medium, or large, the borders get thin, thick, etc. Super cool stuff here. And as you can see, it was so easy to do this. That's why I love Storybook. It just makes this so much easier than having to build your own ingesting application yourself. Now, the final thing I want to do here with Storybook is to demonstrate something called MDX. Now, MDX does not belong to Storybook, I do not believe, but it is a type of syntax where you can kind of combine JSX, which is the ability to render out kind of HTML in your JavaScript. It's what React uses to be able to do this right here. So what you see here, what you're looking at is JSX. You can combine that with Markdown. And what that allows you to do is render out components using Storybook while also documenting and writing Markdown within that, which makes it super easy to document your components as you're writing them. Because even though Storybook is used to develop your components, it's also a great way to demo them and also provide documentation for people who might want to use your components. So with that being said, I want to show you how to use the MDX format. So I cleared out all of my tabs, and I'm going to go back over here, and instead of doing tabler.stories.js, I want to create a new file called tabler.stories.mdx. Now, there's not going to be support for this right out of the box for the syntax in my VS Code. So keep that in mind for a moment. I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to delete my tabler.stories.js file completely because I just want to use MDX from now on. Personally, you can use whatever you like, but for this case, I'm just going to start using MDX, and you can follow along from here if you want to. So personally, I really want to get the syntax support for my VS Code. So if you are using VS Code, this will be super helpful for you. Come over here to your extensions section here. I'm too zoomed in to see it, so I'm going to have to zoom out ever so slightly. And then I can go to my extensions here and type in MDX. And when I type that, you'll see this, this tool here. I'm going to install it. It's going to provide syntax highlighting and bracket matching for MDX. So it's basically support for MDX. Now that should be installed. Now that it's installed, I should be able to write MDX without it looking too terrible. So the first thing I want to do is import meta, story, and canvas from storybook/addon-docs/blocks. I'm going to need these. Then underneath this, I'm going to import my component. Now I'm exporting my component as a non-default export, so I need to include the curly braces. I'm stuttering a lot here. And it's called Tablr, and I'm importing it from /Tablr. So now I have everything I need to begin writing my MDX story. So the first thing I want to do is use this meta tag, which is going to be a way for us to provide a little bit of metadata to Storybook to know what it is we're doing here. So the title is, this is very similar to that default object export that we do in the normal stories syntax. We want to call this Tablr a customizable React table component. Now, really, we probably shouldn't call it that because it made the left rail kind of large, like a little too thick. So I'm just going to call it Tablr and just leave it as that. Then I want to pass in the component itself. So the component, that's another prop. We're going to pass in Tablr as the component. Okay, so now we want to create a canvas. Now the children of canvas is what's going to be obviously inside of your Storybook canvas. And you can put multiple stories inside of here. So I'm going to create a story, and I'm only going to have one in this case because I really only want to have one variation of my component. Again, if you have different variations of whatever component you're building, you can create multiple stories. Make sure to include your closing tag. And then I need to include a prop here that I'm going to set a name. We're going to just call this default. And then inside of here, I can render out JSX. I can actually do like H1 tags and all sorts of stuff. But for now, I'm just going to put in my Tablr. component. And I need to pass in all of the props that it expects, which in this case is 2 because the other ones are default and I don't really feel the need to pass in all of the other ones since we have defaults here. So I'm going to pass in the exact same data that we had for the other one. So let's start with rows. We have the rows, which is an array of strings, a 2-dimensional array of strings, I should say, if we want to get technical, and headers, which is a 1-dimensional array of strings. Let's save this and see what renders out on Storybook. So as of right now, when I refresh, I get absolutely nothing. Let's see what is going on here. So, okay, so it turned out that I just had a small typo in my MDX syntax. Be really careful when you're writing this, unless you have really solid support in your code editor, because I had an extra square bracket right here, which I then removed. And after removing said culprit, I was able to get a step further. Now, as you can see, I was able to get a little further, but it's not quite what I would have expected, right? So actually, I just needed to refresh. So once I refresh, I see exactly what it is I wanted to see, which is the component rendered here on the screen in front of me. Now take a look at this. Since I'm using MDX, I can actually write, sorry, let me get rid of that. I can actually write Markdown in here. So at the very top, I can write some Markdown, say Tablr. And then underneath this, I can write something like a customizable React table component. Save it. And then when I click the Docs tab, you can see that I see my Markdown here. And I can click the show code thing and it shows the actual code that's being rendered here. So that's super cool. So that in case somebody sees this and they want to say like, hey, what do the props look like for this? They can click that. But as you can see, this is a sort of more convenient way to write documentation alongside of your component. So obviously, if you want to get more in depth to the MDX format, I highly recommend you check out the documents here. The documentation for Storybook is robust and very worth checking out if you enjoyed what you saw here today and you want to start using Storybook to build your own component libraries. All right, I think that's going to be it for today. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot about Storybook, and I hope you're excited to use these new tools to make your own component libraries. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next video.